Welcome to this retrospective slash review for the game Rune Classic. And I'm just going to go ahead and jump into my thoughts on the game and just kind of give you a very brief background of, well, how you can obtain the game, some of the differences, and things of that nature. So they call this game Rune Classic because it came out in 2012, but it's really just mostly just a repackaging of the original game that came out in 2000. So, not a lot of differences basically between this version and the original version. I guess theoretically they provided widescreen support and window mode, things that may not have necessarily been there originally in 2000. But graphically, the game is still pretty much exactly the same as it was back then. Um, and even gameplay wise, it's still the exact same as it was in 2000. And that's not a criticism on my part. It's just a bit of an interesting observance of the game, and that it's kind of like it's repackaged as a new and improved version of the game. And maybe it is to a certain extent, but it's very minor improvements, to be completely and totally honest with you. Um, it's not like a complete and total remake of the game or remaster or anything of that nature. So very minor improvements from that perspective. Now, I do want to go ahead and point out a couple of interesting things that I learned when I started playing this game, because I got it on GOG, but you can also get it on Steam, and there's a pretty distinct um, difference that should be noted between the two versions of the game, and that is that you actually have Steam achievements if you get it via Steam, and there are no achievements via the GOG version of the game, even though, with the GOG Galaxy client, you would theoretically have achievement capability if you wanted to play with achievements. So that is something to keep in mind between which platform you may want to purchase the game on. Um, Having said that, there are a lot of multiplayer achievements involved with this game on Steam, and those may be a little more difficult to come by unless you have someone that's, have a group of friends or someone that would be willing to work with you to get said achievements with the game. Um, so, from my personal playthrough, I think if I had been playing it on Steam, I probably would have ended up around 15, maybe 16 out of the 29 achievements, roughly. I definitely know that they had achievements for eating a bunch of lizards, and I definitely would have got that one for absolutely certain, because I consumed many a cold-blooded reptile in this game. But anyway, as far as the game itself, I think it definitely it looks like an early Unreal Engine game, because it is. And I will go ahead and say that compared to the last Unreal Engine game that I played, this one actually was very easy to set up. So that may be one of the things that they did that was improved in this game compared to, say, an older, non-updated Unreal Engine game, is that they made this one easier to set up and get running. So I didn't have to jump through a lot of hoops or anything to get the game configured and working properly. So I do have to give them credit for that. Very easy to get up and running. Having said that, there is basically a game-breaking bug very close to the end of the game. So if you didn't watch my playthrough, I believe it's in the Barren Canyons map, or the one right after that. I forget exactly which one of those two maps. But basically, if you'll hit a cutscene, and that cutscene will completely and totally lock up the game every single time. And the only way around it, fortunately, very easy fix: turn your sound all the way down. I think there may be other fixes as well, but the sound of that cutscene isn't really necessary as far as that's concerned. So it's just easier just to turn the sound off and then turn it back on after the cutscene's done. So for a game that provided all these updates and everything to make it easy to work on modern platforms, well, modern in 2012, I should say, um, it's interesting that bug is still there, because you would think that would be something that would be relatively easy for them to correct, and it still exists. Now, part of that may be due to the fact that the company that originally put this game out, I believe they went out of business, but the source code was released to somebody else. If you read the Wikipedia article for the game, it sounds like a very convoluted legal shenanigans around studios closing and things of that nature. So interesting. Short explanation is, it's interesting that they decided to call this Rune Classic and not just Rune, because it's not, like I said, a huge update. But anyway, that being beside the point, graphics and sound, pretty good. I mean, I think they still holds up. It is a little bit dark, though. I will say the game itself is very dark. And just for me to actually be able to see a lot of stuff, I had to make sure I had the lights off in my room, and make sure there's no sun coming through the window and everything, a lot of times, just so I could see what was going on in the background. And even then, it was sometimes a little difficult. In fact, from a needing a guide perspective, I don't think this game is one that I needed a lot of guide usage to figure my way out. In fact, up until about the last area where you're in Loki's domain, basically, I didn't really even consult the guide. I just looked at it for basically what names of the levels are and roughly how many there are. And no offense to the one guide I found on GameFAQs, it's kind of a convoluted, the guide. Like I said, no offense to him, he did a good job with it, all things considered. And the way the game just kind of flows from one level to the next, it is sometimes hard to distinguish when a level starts and when a level ends. So, like I said, I don't want to criticize the guy too much. In fact, it did help me there at the end in Loki's domain, where I did actually get a little confused at the point. Could I have figured it out probably on my own? Yeah, probably. I mean, one of the things that I was missing basically was that there's a wall I had to break, and it just wasn't very obvious that I had to break this wall to move forward. Outside of that, the game itself, not very heavy from a guide usage perspective. It's just that the darkness of the game definitely plays against it when you're trying to figure out where you're supposed to go, because sometimes it's not very obvious. In fact, I remember, again, fairly close to the end of the game, there's this one section, and I just like, what am I supposed to do here? And I literally had to walk up to my TV and see that there is a board stretched across a ravine, basically, and you had to basically tightrope walk along this little board. It was very thin, and it's very hard to see. So definitely the darkness of the game is a factor that does work against it. Maybe that was also by design. They used that as a way to introduce some challenge, theoretically. The game itself is actually very linear. There's just not a lot to it from a branching paths or anything of that nature. Very linear story-based game. I think I did read a review shortly before doing this. It says story is non-existent. I'm like, well, I don't know if I would say it's non-existent. It is relatively minimal, but to be fair, a lot of the games around this time, that was kind of, par for the course, really. Some of them have, more story-heavy games. I mean, like, are driven, like The Wheel of Time, the one I just played before this. You could say it definitely had a heavier story driven aspect to it. But I would say this game here, you've got to give it a little bit of credit, is like the cutscenes, I feel, do hold up a little bit better, for instance, because the cutscenes are in-game cutscenes, so it's not as jarring a transition from the cutscene in the game to back to the gameplay. So I do feel that is a benefit for this game. So it's very consistent. That's the word I want to look for. It's very consistent with its look and feel, basically. And I do believe that the sound design in the game is actually pretty good. I do like it. The subtitles, on the other hand, that is one thing that unfortunately they didn't give you a good option to turn up the size of the subtitles. It wasn't a huge issue until like you got to the part where you're listening to the dwarves, and the dwarves are speaking Dwarvish. I'm assuming Dwarvish, and they're speaking their own language, and you can't understand what they're saying without reading the subtitles. And that was when it would get a little more glaringly obvious that the subtitles being so small was a hindrance, basically. Because then again, you'd have to kind of get a little close to the screen just to actually see what they are saying. And some of the stuff they said was actually pretty funny. As they're sitting there insulting you and taunting you, basically. So that was actually pretty funny, but you can't really see it from a distance, to be completely honest with you. So there is that aspect. So the subtitles were a little bit just too small. Now, from a control perspective, I like to play on my TV more often than not, and I did use the Anti-Micro-X program to map buttons to my controller, and I have got to say, for this style of game especially, that works really well. Now, a lot of people, may scoff at doing that for, say, a first-person shooter when you're playing them, but a lot of those people stick by mouse and keyboard as a superior control scheme, and technically, yeah, I actually don't disagree with you. I do believe that mouse keyboard is a better control scheme, but by me mapping this to my controller, I felt like using a controller for this game, a dual joystick controller, it worked very, very good. I mean, almost like that was the way the game was meant to be played, to be completely honest with you. So if you're thinking about playing this game, I would highly recommend looking for the Anti-Micro-X program and then just mapping everything there and assigning the keys in the game to what you had assigned to in Anti-Micro-X. And I think from that perspective, the game controls really well when you do it that way. So in a way, I can't honestly tell you how the native controls for the game are because I didn't really use them. So I did use like the up button on my D-pad to change my sword. Left I did for axes, and right I did for the blunt weapons. And that seemed to work really well for me, I believe. And so yeah, from a control perspective, the game worked really well when I did that. Some may consider that a hack, a workaround or something. I'm not entirely sure if you can consider that. That's just the way I prefer to play. It may not be as well controlled when using a mouse and keyboard. I just honestly don't know. But that's how I played it. And actually, I think one of the reviews said the soundtrack was not actually very good. I actually thought the soundtrack was pretty good. There were a lot of instances where the soundtrack would just completely and totally stop and there'd be silence. In fact, there were times in the game where I bugged out the sound to the point where the sound just wouldn't play at all. So that definitely did happen. But for the most part, I thought the soundtrack's pretty good. Side note, I don't know if this is the case on Steam or not, but I will say that this game on GOG, and I haven't really looked at it yet, but it comes with a complete and total RPG based upon this game and the world, basically. And when I say RPG, something like Dungeons and Dragons or, any of those tabletop RPGs, something like that. And it's a pretty hefty book. It's like 225, 250 pages, somewhere in that range. So it's It's not a tiny PDF. So that's an interesting bonus. I would hope that the Steam version also comes with that. Another thing I got with the GOG version is the soundtrack was there. It was in WAV format, so I had to convert it to MP3 to upload it to my Google Music share. But it was nice having the soundtrack provided as well. The game itself is fairly cheap, even without being on sale. So I think it's a short playthrough, but it was fun. One criticism I would probably mention is really mostly the lack of any ranged weaponry at all in the game. It's all melee. And whether or not you feel that's a negative or positive, that kind of, is up to you, really. But technically, I guess there is a ranged weapon. The fact that you can throw your currently equipped weapon. I'm not a big fan of doing that, especially since like you could literally lose your weapon and think about it. You're throwing your sword, your axe, your hammer, whatever, and then it's gone. So it's not like using a bow and arrow or something. And I felt like there were certain areas of the game where if I had had a bow and arrow, that would have been interesting, even if it's just a very small quiver of arrows and you could only do it so much. I don't know. I think that was a bit of a missed opportunity, and the throw mechanics were a little bit wonky, to be completely honest. Very hard to aim because it's not like you have a crosshair or reticule or anything where you can actually see where you're throwing it at. So it's not very precise, to say the least. So that's probably why they didn't include that as a weapon choice. Each one of the weapons, they didn't really feel like they had a lot of distinct differences with them. I do felt like as I got further into the game, like the newer weapons did feel like they had a little more power to them, but it wasn't really explicitly stated like whether or not these weapons would have any tangible, like this is much more powerful. The only thing that the weapons had going for them is that each one of them had a different type of rune power, and now that partly comes down to me. I didn't really use a lot of the rune powers in the game. I think the starting sword I used probably more than anything, and that was because it was a vampire or life leech type rune ability, where I could use that to heal myself. So I would use that quite a bit. There was I think one of the dwarven work sword or something of that nature, where it had a lightning effect. I used that occasionally, and that was actually quite helpful. But for the most part, I don't know. I think the rune powers are kind of interesting. The idea behind them is interesting, but in the heat of battle, it just didn't usually click in my mind to turn on said rune powers more often than not. So it's an interesting idea and something I think is a good aspect to the game, but it's not something I really took too much advantage of, to be completely honest. And that's not really a criticism of the game, that's more criticism of me. Because there was plenty of times I noticed where there were rune factors where I could pick up these runes and recharge my rune power, and I just didn't do it because my rune magic was completely totally full because I never used any rune magic. So that's more of a self-criticism, if you will, basically. Now, the game itself does have a fairly extensive multiplayer mode, it looks like, but I can't really comment on that because I didn't really play multiplayer. And because this is a much older game, your chances of, getting multiplayer matches together, pretty slim. You probably have to be people that are also familiar with the game and know about it and would be willing to engage in those multiplayer battles. So kind of hard to really judge the game positively or negatively as far as multiplayer is concerned. But as far as the single player story is concerned, it's a fun game, and like I said, it's not expensive, so I think it's definitely worth the price of admission for sure. And I enjoyed myself with the game. Definitely wasn't really too frustrating. Like I said, I got a little confused in the Loki area, but outside of that, for the most part, I was able to figure my way through the game, you know, without any major issues really. So it's a fun game, but it's also a somewhat limited game. You know, if you compare it to say Wheel of Time, Unreal, you can tell like there's just much more variety and whatnot in those early Unreal Engine games. And I haven't got around to playing it yet, at least not here recently. But you know, Deus Ex is probably truly the gold standard for the early Unreal Engine games. Unreal 1, I would say. And you know, from that perspective, it's definitely a much more limited game, but it's fun. And I think this third person perspective actually works really well here in this game for sure. But you know, it does feel like it could have had more aspects to it. And one of the criticisms that I did read online was like there should have been some more role-playing aspects or things of that nature. And I can't really fault the reviewer for saying that, because that would have given this game a little more meat, as it were. But at the end of the day, I think I would give it an 85%. It's definitely, you know, it's fun time. I think you'll enjoy it, but it's not like groundbreaking or anything of that nature. Decent game, or I'd say above average. It's fun, and I think you'll enjoy it as well. So anyway, that's my thoughts on the game. And yeah, thank you very much for watching this video, and I will see you all in the next one. Take care.